Good evening and welcome back to our semester Bible study, Ezekiel, Fiery Throne and Dry Bones. And today we're looking at chapters 40 through 43, the New Temple. And we will not read every bit of those chapters. If you looked at them ahead of time, they're hard to get through, aren't they? Yeah, I saw some expressions that matched my experience in trying to get through those. But we'll talk about um, why so much measurement and all of that. But before we do that, we'll review the two sticks from last week's lesson over chapter 37. And I will apologize in advance for my voice, but I think, I have my hot tea and I, I think I'm understandable, even if I don't sound smooth. Okay, so Ezekiel had a sign act that he was doing with two sticks, or maybe staffs, which would be symbols of authority, standing for kingdoms, or maybe even trees, which is an important motif across scripture because this is one word that gets translated to all of those things when we go from Hebrew to English. So, what was God promising to do that was represented by these two sticks?
He was uniting the two kingdoms, and he was bringing restoration.
Yeah, so there's the we know from our history of Israel that long ago, back in Saul, David, and Solomon, they were united, and then after Solomon, they broke into the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. And to bring those back together is God's promise that was represented by these two sticks or staffs or trees. Bring back the united kingdom of Israel. Yeah. And you talked about restoration. What were the parts of restoration that we talked about?
Um, one of which was like a place for holiness to happen, um, bringing the people back together was part of it.
Yeah, gathering them back
Gathering. Mhm.
onto their own land. So they had this place, and it had overtones of like the promised land that to start with, right? Where they could forever live as their own nation on that own land. Yeah. What else?
God's sanctuary is there with them, and the ark is there again.
Okay, so God mentions the sanctuary, and we know that the ark, like we just never hear again about the ark. And most scholars assume that Babylon broke it up for gold when the temple was destroyed, and um, the implements, the holy utensils of the temple were carted off to foreign lands. Um, but we don't know. And instead, here we get this promise of God. Oh, I will put my sanctuary among them. And we even get a little reference to the that being today we get a little reference to the footstool, which was sometimes referred to the ark. So remind me if I don't remember to mention it, because that's not in my notes, but I do think it's very interesting when we get to today's lesson. But this idea that God would put a sanctuary among them is the new material in in the two sticks passage, right? That's the new content. The rest of these bits of restoration are thematic elements that we have seen before. So, anyone think of any others that we've seen, other repeats from those passages?
We see a breakaway from having hearts of stone that will be able to walk and live as God intended.
Yeah, that idea gets pulled in. I will be their God and they will be my people. I will renew a covenant of peace with them. And so that idea that they won't have idolatry anymore because they will have this relationship with God really repeats that heart of flesh instead of heart of stone, and I will put my spirit in them that we saw in these previous passages. Yeah, and then finally we have this like idea of the one king over them, or we've seen it before as the one shepherd over them, David, who will be a prince among them. So we have this promise of leadership from the line of David that helps them live in God's ways. So we talked, as we discussed those, we sort of re- refined them into 5 important themes of Ezekiel that as we're nearing the end of Ezekiel, that this passage really brings out, and then we can say, these were themes that we discovered in our book. So restoration to land, to abundance, to that Eden-like place. Leadership, so Davidic shepherding or kingship. Righteousness, the ability to walk in God's ways. Covenant, God renews the covenant of shalom, of wholeness, wellness, of peace, brings the gifts that God always promised as blessings that went with the covenant. And then witness, that other people, that they and the nations would know that who God is by God's merciful actions, by God's great love and restoration and pursuit of these people. And so those 5 themes are important themes of Ezekiel, and we saw those all in the 2 sticks passage. And then the last thing we talked about is, what is the connection between the Valley of Dry Bones vision and this 2 sticks sign act that we see, sort of back to back in one sort of vision story? How do those relate to each other?
It's this promise that even those that have passed are going to be brought back and fulfilled to live as God intended.
Yeah, unity is a part of restoration, and resurrection, new life is a part of resurrection. And so we talked about their restoration as being both in new life and in unity, and how important unity is for us. New life is part of what we're promised in Jesus Christ and in the indwelling and empowering of the Spirit. And that should lead us towards unity as well. Yeah. What else?
Well, I think both the resurrection. You have two dead cities or dead nations at that point. I mean, the northern kingdom's basically gone at this point. And the southern kingdom basically is um, really gone. I mean, it has no hope of restoration. So they're both dead. So it's not just a personal resurrection, but a resurrection of 2 nations that are dead.
Yeah, nations who will become one kingdom, and that kingdom always had a purpose, right? Israel was chosen to be a light to other nations. They were made into a nation in order to be a light to the other nations. And so that part of God's project, their role in God's project, can be restored through their being restored as nations. And so we talked about how they needed to become one in order to point to God's great love and mercy, and in order for them to be a witness as a nation to these other peoples. And as Christians, we're grafted into the people of God. We are adopted as God's children. And we would also look to being part of God's project to be light, like a city on a hill, like a cannot be hidden, as Jesus put it among other parables. We are part of how God brings God's project to being. We are a Christian body in order to be that light, just as Israel was to be light. So we should hope to pursue unity so that God can use us to bring hope out of despair, as we see here. Yeah. Other thoughts, comments, anything you found memorable you want to talk about from last week? Well, we saw that new promise, I will put my sanctuary in their midst forever. And we're going to, we said that was some foreshadowing to this final vision. And so we're starting our final vision tonight. We're spending 2 weeks on the final vision because it's quite long. And today we'll look at the new temple. And we're going to read two sections of this, one from chapter 40 and one from chapter 43. So let's begin with Ezekiel 41 through 16. Would someone read that? Someone who doesn't mind a little repetition.
I'll read it.
Thank you.
In the 25th year of our exile, at the beginning of the year, and on the 10th day of the month, in the 14th year after the city was struck down, on that very day, the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me to the city. In visions, in visions of God, he brought me to the land of Israel and set me down on a very high mountain, on which was a structure like a city to the south. And when he brought me there, behold, there was a man whose appearance was like bronze, with a linen cord and a measuring reed in his hand. And he was standing in the gateway. And the man said to me, Son of man, look with your eyes and hear with your ears, and set up on your heart all that I shall show you. For you were brought here in order that I might show it to you. Declare all that you see to the house of Israel. And behold, there was a wall all around the outside of the temple area, and the length of the measuring reed in the man's hand was 6 long cubits, each being a cubit and a handbreadth in length. So he measured the thickness of the wall, 1 reed, and the height 1 reed. Then he went into the gateway facing east, going up its steps, and measured the threshold of the gate, 1 reed deep, and the side rooms 1 reed long and 1 reed broad, and the space between the side rooms 5 cubits, and the threshold of the gate by the vestibule of the gate at the inner end 1 reed. And then he measured the vestibule of the gateway on the inside 1 reed. And then he measured the vestibule of the gateway 8 cubits, and its jambs 2 cubits, and the vestibule and the gate was at the inner end. And there were 3 side rooms on either side of the east gate. The 3 were of the same size, and the jambs on either side were of the same size. And then he measured the width of the opening of the gateway 10 cubits, and the length of the gateway 13 cubits. There was a barrier before the side rooms, 1 cubit on either side, and the side rooms were 6 cubits on either side. Then he measured the gate from the ceiling of the one side room to the ceiling of the other, a breadth of 25 cubits. The opening faced each other. And he measured also the vestibule 60 cubits. Around the vestibule of the gateway was the court. From the front of the gate at the entrance to the front of the inner vestibule of the gate was 50 cubits. And the gateway had windows all around, narrowing inwards toward the side rooms and toward their jambs. And likewise, the vestibule had windows all around inside, and on the jambs were palm trees.
Thank you. Okay, so that was very good. And we appreciate it. Okay, let's go all the way back to verse 1 and look at the introduction to the vision. Okay, so verse 1 is pretty rich with information. What is the first thing we learned?
It's
What year it was?
the 25th year of their exile.
Yeah, the 25th year of the exile. Now, what year of the exile was it when Ezekiel first had his first vision in chapter 1?
The 5th year.
5th year. Okay, so it has been 20 years, right? And when we read chapter 1, we learned how old Ezekiel was. How old was he then?
He was 30.
30-ish,
Yeah, he was 30. So how old is he now?
50.
50, right? Well, do we remember the significance of his being 30 when he had that first vision?
That's when he was first supposed to go into priesthood.
Yeah, this is the active service of the priests. So that's when they would begin their service in the temple. And if we, have a passage in your, preparation material, if you use that, Numbers 4:46 through 47 says, All the numbered men of the Levites, whom Moses and Aaron and the leaders of Israel numbered by their families and by their father's household, from 30 years old and upward to 50 years old, everyone who could enter the work of service and the work of carrying in the tent of meeting. So, how would we explain the significance of Ezekiel's age now?
At the end of his priesthood.
Yeah, this would be kind of traditionally the final year of his service. And this opening of this final vision is happening at the closing of his priestly service. So Ezekiel has spent his entire priesthood career, not being a priest because he has not been in Israel, he's been in exile, but rather serving as God's representative in this prophetic mission. This whole 20-year career has been the prophecy that we see in this book. And it's, I find this to be meaningful, that this is his life's work. This is the product of his whole career here. These visions and these promises. Um, Thoughts or questions? Well, there's one more, kind of two, one more connected piece of information here. When is it specifically? We know it's the 25th year. What time of year is it?
Beginning of the year. I don't know what that means though.
Okay, so the first month of the Jewish year opens, the first day of the first month is Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah. So that is, the first day of the new year would be Rosh Hashanah, but it is not the first day, it is the 10th day. And those 10 days were Jewish days of penitence, and the 10th day of the year is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. So if there were a temple and if there were priests, this would be the day of the year, the one day of the year, when the high priest would enter the most holy place to offer the blood of the sacrifice and the incense of the sacrifice onto the surface of the ark. This was the most important sacrificial day, the holiest priestly day. It was the day the high priest would speak out loud the name of Yahweh that they didn't normally speak out loud. And so this is an extremely important holy day of the Jewish year. And yet we also are reminded it's the 14th year since what?
Since Jerusalem was struck down.
Yeah, so none of this can be done. None of the traditional rites can be completed. There's no temple, there's no holy place, there's no high priest, there's no Ark of the Covenant. There is no way to approach God. And so I think we take our whole vision as it's coming as a connecting point, right? This is the way that God is approaching the people on this day that they would normally have to approach God. And so that's the sort of umbrella context for our vision. So moving on to verse 2, and comments or questions?
I'm struck a little bit that the temple was destroyed on the Day of Atonement, and there's so much symbolism in that.
Oh, do we think that means that? I don't know. The
Well, I
vision
mean,
is on the Day
it
of
says
Atonement, but
it says on the very day that this temple was destroyed.
on that, we could look that up. The referent may be on that very day, the hand of the Lord was upon me.
Oh
Like
God,
the vision. I'm not sure that phrase is in between.
yeah,
And
you're right.
I would have to look closer to know.
I was trying to look back
That
again.
would be incredible, wouldn't
That,
it?
that would be incredible.
Yeah, there's a comma where we wouldn't have had a comma.
I'll take
Well,
a
and
look. I'll look up
interpreters
24.
have to put in the commas, right?
Right,
So
right. So
that might be. I don't know that. That's an interesting idea. That we'll put that on our for future
Future
research.
exploration.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Anything else? Well, in verse 2, where does God take Ezekiel?
He takes them up on the highest of high places in Israel.
Yes, a very high mountain, right? And so are we thinking that this is an actual place, an actual earthly place that Ezekiel's been physically transported to?
That's such a good
No,
question.
right? I saw
Yeah.
some notes. It does say in visions.
Yes.
And so I think this is representing, this is a vision reality that represents a physical reality would be how I would interpret this, right? What place does it represent?
The high place, the holy place, close
Yeah.
to God.
Okay, so first of all, it's high because it's very high because higher means closer to God, right? This is the mountain symbolism that we've discussed. But in Israel, that would be the Temple Mount. It would be Zion, right? So this probably represents Zion. And we have what does he see on Zion or on the very high mountain?
Structure like a city.
Okay, it's like a city. And so I think that this phrase, and there's some discussion about what does structure like a city mean. I think this means that it has walls and gates like a city, but that it is a single structure. And we can tell what this structure is because in verse 5, Ezekiel begins to refer to it as what it's supposed to be. So, what is it supposed to be?
The temple.
Yeah, the temple. So this would be like the Jerusalem temple, but we see, because it's not actually Jerusalem, we get no mention of the rest of the city of Jerusalem or even the ruins of Jerusalem, right? This is a sort of an idealized version, vision version, right? The other idealized thing is, we talked about this briefly when we talked about mountains as a symbol, but how high are the mountains in Israel?
They're not very high, they're more like hills.
Yeah, they're more like hills, but in this vision, it's very high, right? So why do you think that is?
It's probably to symbolize the closeness to God.
Yeah. Yeah, and probably, we would definitely expect Ezekiel, a priest who is in exile, longing for his homeland, to maybe have a romantic view of his homeland. And so that may enter into it, but also sometimes when the prophets speak about the Temple Mount in end times terms, the Temple Mount gets transformed into this extremely high mountain. So I'm going to read from Isaiah 2. 2 through 4, but also Micah 4 1 through 3 reads almost the exact same, and there are other passages that convey this. So this is just a representative one. Isaiah 2 2. Now it will come about that in the last days the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of mountains, and it will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it, and many peoples will come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, and we may walk in his paths. We're seeing some of those themes, aren't we? Some of those themes that have been repeated so far are coming out here as well. For the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, and he will judge between the nations, and will render decisions for many peoples, and they will hammer their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks, weapons of war into farming tools. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war. And so these are those paradise promises that happen when the house of the Lord is raised up above the hills. And I think Ezekiel's vision fits into this category that we see. Yeah. Thoughts on that?
Just reiterating what was said earlier, just the fact that, yeah, the mountains aren't that high and it's a temple. So it's God's nearness, it's his closeness that elevates. And like the rising up of Ezekiel, like he lifted him.
Oh, yes,
Show
he
him
does.
to
And that
his-
happens in
Yes,
this passage.
yes.
Yes. Yeah, that idea of like when we are at our lowest, the Spirit lifts us up, shows up so many times. Yeah. Well, Ezekiel sees a being in verse 3. And what do we know about this being? What do we learn about this person?
He's a man like bronze with a linen cord and a measuring reed.
Okay. Yeah. So, like bronze, what do you make of that?
And it sounds angelic.
It does. We've seen this multiple times, right?
Yeah.
This has happened in earlier prophetic. We saw it in Ezekiel's first vision. Things that are described as like bronze must have a warm, golden, shiny glow. And it's a common descriptor for angelic or heavenly beings, right? We see it with the cherubim and the I think it shows up in the being on the throne. This bronzeness definitely. So it sort of was that's a little angelic being that we hear, and then it it gets carried through, right? Revelation will use that as well. So when we see it in Revelation, we go, this is following the pattern that we've seen here in Ezekiel. Okay, what's the linen cord for?
I don't know what the cord's for, but it always makes me think of the other verse, the three strands. Are
Okay, a
I
cord
don't
of
know,
three
that's the only
strands
thing that
is broken.
came to
Yeah,
mind.
yeah.
But I guess they're measuring tools. I don't know.
Yeah, this would be like a surveyor line. This would be something that's used for longer measurements. And when we get to Ezekiel 47, in 47:3, um, the angel uses the linen cord for measuring. So it does like bear out that that's what it's for. Um, and then of course the measuring reed or rod, and we can translate that either way, is obviously for measuring, right? You notice that he addresses Ezekiel as God has addressed Ezekiel, right? Ezekiel is a son of man. Ezekiel is a human person, whereas this being is not. He is an angelic being. So we have an angelic guide, our angel guide, or the measuring angel, appears throughout this vision. And the trope of the angelic guide first appears here in Ezekiel, but it will appear repeatedly in other books. It will be central to Zechariah. And then it becomes a feature of apocalyptic literature. If you were here for our Daniel study, you may remember the angelic guide showed up in our Daniel study, and it will show up in Revelation. So we're seeing a pattern starting up here as the angel becomes Ezekiel's guide. So beginning in verse 5, they go about, right? And then we read from verse 5 to verse 16, and it was pretty repetitive. But how would you sum up what's happening in those verses?
They're surveying the city.
Yeah, yes, this structure like a city, which he calls the temple, beginning in verse 5, they are surveying it, meaning they're going on a tour and they're taking measurements, right? So, and there's a lot of measuring. What does measuring mean here? Why is there so much measuring? What does it represent?
Well, you go back to what is it, Exodus, where they start building the temple, and it's the same kind of thing. All
Yeah, it
this,
feels very similar. Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I don't think you were done.
oh no, I was just saying all the same kind of measurement.
Yes, so in Ezekiel we get like instructions, make it like this, make it like that, and we get all of these measurements. Here we have a temple, and the angel is measuring it, and Ezekiel's coming along, and so we have that same sense of pattern, don't we? Moses built the tabernacle according to the plans he saw on the mountain. So we have a sense that Moses went to Mount Sinai, had a vision of God there that revealed to him the pattern by which the tabernacle was to be built. And then we have the instructions for building the tabernacle. Um, in Exodus 25, 8 through 9 is one of the passages that indicates that it's according to that pattern, right? Let them construct a sanctuary for me, that I may dwell among them. According to all that I'm going to show you, this is God saying to Moses, I'm going to show you as the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all of its furniture, just so you shall construct it. Right. So, yeah, it feels so much like Exodus. It has that sense of pattern. We get the same thing in First Kings 6 and 7, detailed dimensions for the temple. The tabernacle is the smallest because, they had to pack it up and carry it. And then the temple is larger. And then this temple is larger still. So here we see this sort of pattern of an idealized temple. Okay, what else do we see? What else does measuring mean?
I think there's a sense of judgment or rightness, uprightness, maybe.
Okay, rightness or uprightness. Yeah, yeah. And righteousness and justice, right? These are linked words. So there is a sense that this size and the symmetry, one of the features, if you were to draw this all out, you would have to make some guesses. There are not every dimension is included. The heights are not often included. But if you were to draw it out, you could, and a lot of people have, and you can Google and find some. My study Bible even has like a version that they think like, here's what it might have looked like. um, but but there's enough information there that you could draw something, and it would be exceedingly symmetrical. Symmetry is one of the features. And so, right, I think this is like Darren said, there's a sense of perfection, um, of the beauty and symmetry that God's place will have. It's both grand in size, bigger than before, and highly symmetrical, like a sense um, of holy precision, perfection here. Yeah, yeah. What else? Anything else struck out at you? We can notice here that there's quite an emphasis on gates, right? So many gates, so many doorways, so many east gate in the part we read, and then part we didn't read. There's a repetitive pattern where it goes through the north gate and the south gate, and then the gates to the inner courts. And so we have all of these measurements of gates. What do gates represent? What do they mean?
A way, like a way to God, like a
Passage.
passageway, like open to, I see it as being open to all.
Open. So there is a sense of access, and a gate can close, right? So it is both, it can open and allow access, or close and limit access, right? This is the meaning of gates, opening and closing for access, right? And so I think if we sort of put together everything symbolized by measuring, including defining access, we could sum up all of this measurement as meaning this is a pattern of the house of God. It is a great and grand and perfect pattern for where God would dwell. And it's marked off what belongs to God. And God this creates, when God dwells among humans, there's always a focus on a way to approach God in God's awesome holiness, right? This God is, the whole point is access to God. And yet those gates tell us that access to God is not trivial, right? God dwelling with mankind is beautiful, but it's not to be taken lightly. God is so awesome that there's even danger in approaching God. And so you approach God in the proper way, and how important that is. And I think that's what we're getting out of all of these measurements and what they would mean to someone who, is of more of the culture of their time. Yeah. Yeah. What other thoughts on that? Well, a temple building, no matter how grand in scale and symmetry, is nothing if it's empty, right? An empty temple is not a true temple. And we saw at the conclusion of the tabernacle, when it was completed, Exodus 40:34 through 35 says, "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle." And we get a equivalent passage with Solomon's temple in 1 Kings 8:10 through 11. It happened that when the priests came from the holy place, the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. So once everything is marked off as a space worthy of God and belonging to God, then we know what to expect next in this holy, idealized temple. So let's turn to Ezekiel 43. And would someone read verses 1 through 11, please?
I will.
Yeah, please.
Then he led me to the gate facing east. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was coming from the east. And the sound of his coming was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. And the vision I saw was just like the vision that I had seen when he came to destroy the city, and just like the vision that I had seen by the Kibar Canal. And I fell on my face as the glory of the Lord entered the temple by the gate facing east. The Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the temple. What am I going to, Deanna?
To 11, through 11.
11. Okay. While the man was standing beside me, I heard one speaking to me out of the temple, and he said to me, "Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell in the midst of the people of Israel forever. And the house of Israel shall no more defile my holy name, neither they nor their kings, by their whoring and by their dead bodies of their kings and their high places, by setting their threshold by my threshold, and their doorposts beside my doorposts, with only a wall between me and them. They have defiled my holy name by their abominations that they have committed, so that I consumed them in my anger. Now let them put away their whoring and dead bodies of their kings far from me, and I will dwell in their midst forever. As for you, son of man, describe to the house of Israel the temple, that they may be ashamed of their iniquities, and that they shall measure the plan. And if they are ashamed of all that they have done, make known to them the design of the temple and its arrangement, its exits and entrances, that is, its whole design, and make known to them as well as its statutes and its whole design and all its laws, and write it down in their sight, so that they may observe all its laws and all its statutes and carry them out.
Okay. So, and then the law of the temple is in the next couple of chapters. Like it proceeds with all the procedures of the temple, right? That's what comes next. So it's pointing to that we won't continue and read. So let's go back to verses. Let's look at 1 through 5 first. So, what do you notice in this first little paragraph? It's a paragraph in mine. It may, whatever 1 through 5 is.
To me, it's kind of like creation imagery.
Okay, how so?
Well, just the sound of the waters. I think of the brooding spirit over the waters, and God creating light like his
Yeah,
word. So,
and the land was radiant.
mhm.
Yeah, there's that sense of water and light there. Oh, very interesting. Yeah, yeah. What else?
He's coming from the east. Is that where the Israelites have been taken? I forget.
Yes, yeah. So, if we look back to when the glory of the Lord departed from the temple, that the chariot throne, the whole thing departs away to the east. And so here, Ezekiel faces east and it's coming back from the east. So it's this idea that God has gone into exile with God's people and is now returning to the land, to this temple, to the dwelling place that God, as God is promising. Yeah, absolutely. And notice how many times it says east, right? That's really emphasized by repetition. Yeah, good point. What else? What is it like? What is he the glory of the Lord that Ezekiel sees? What is it like?
It's just like when he had seen it at Chibar Canal and when he was destroying the city.
Yeah, so it's the same thing Ezekiel saw in vision 1 and vision 2 where the glory of the Lord appeared, right? So we can envision the whole thing, the whole chariot throne, right? The cherubim with their four faces and their four wings and the whirling wheels within wheels that can move in any direction and the gemstone expanse that was carried on the over the heads of the cherubim and the gemstone throne on the expanse and the presence of the glory of the Lord and the fire and the light and the rushing wind. And so we get that sense of rushing waters and the radiance of God's glory that really fit that what we've called the storm theophany. Remember how it came in a storm when Ezekiel first saw it in chapter 1? And so Ezekiel is telling us by shorthand here, it was all of that again. And so, just as the glory of the Lord departed, it is returning in great majesty and noise and probably a scary scene, right? What does Ezekiel do? What is his response?
He
Fell on
fell
his
on his
face.
face.
Yeah, yeah, this glory, it's overwhelming. Right? It's awesome. It's supremely powerful. And here we see again, just as Judy was pointing out, when Ezekiel has fallen, the Spirit lifts him and brings him to the next part of the vision. In verse 6, we see Ezekiel. Here's someone speaking. He's like, the angel was standing next to me. So it wasn't the angel, right? The man with the linen cord was right there. But I heard another voice speaking. So we're to know who's speaking. Who's speaking?
God.
God, right? So God is speaking, and what is God's plan for this temple?
It's
It's
where
to
he
be set
lives
apart from the
forever.
Okay, I missed both of those. Paige, what did you say?
I said it's where he will live with among the Israelites forever.
Yeah, this dwelling place, and so we get the place for the soles of my feet, which is usually this is back to what Darren was mentioning, is usually a descriptor for the ark. We don't get a specific mention of the ark, and once the ark gets moved into Solomon's temple, it never gets mentioned again. It's missing, which leads to romantic adventure stories like um, you know Indiana Jones. But the the ark was always this idea of it was both a throne and the footstool of the heavenly throne. And so even without mention of the ark, we have that same thing, that idea of connection, right? That God will dwell here, but it's also that God is dwelling on God's heavenly throne, and it is connected as if a footstool, with this temple dwelling, right? It's both and. Yeah. What else?
The set apartness from like all of the corrupt, sinful ways of the Israelites. Um, he's claiming this place for himself, and,
Right.
and
Don't
just
go building your idols there,
yes,
and that idea of prostitution as the primary, or this very common metaphor for turning to other gods,
yes,
shows up again, right? And talk about a theme of the first half of Ezekiel that
yeah,
we see repeated, right? That idea of um, singular worship of God alone is what is required because of the
mhm.
holiness of God and the holiness of the God's dwelling place in this temple. Yeah, you won't go back to doing all these things and defiling the land, right? Like that long story of the 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 nations defiled the land, and God removed them and brought in Israel, and then Israel became even worse and defiled the land, and God removed them, and now he wants to bring them back, but never again to defile the land. Instead, they will follow God's ways, right? So now, is this a temple that they are supposed to build, right? God showed Moses the pattern on the mountain. They had instructions to build the temple. David, in Chronicles, David says, oh yes, God gave me these plans and I gave them down to Solomon. And Solomon was instructed to build the temple. The instruction for Solomon to build the temple is in Kings and Chronicles. It's just in Chronicles that David says, yes, I got the plans from God. So is this the same? Is there an instruction to build this temple?
Well, it says carry out the laws and statutes, which could mean build it. It's hard to say.
It is hard to say, isn't it?
Mm.
There's certainly no explicit command, go build this. And some scholars think that the dimensions are not always practical, that like the walls are too thin and the structure's too much for the thinness of the walls, and the gates are too much. And I think that there's a symbolic emphasis on gates we talked about. And so, is this a temple to be built? When the Israelites came back to the land, they, in the era of like Ezra and Nehemiah, and we read, they came back, they rebuilt Jerusalem, the walls of Jerusalem, the temple, but it was smaller than Solomon's temple. And it wasn't as grand, and it wasn't as beautiful. And people who had seen Solomon's temple, wept when they saw the new temple out of disappointment. It wasn't, doesn't seem to have the qualities of this temple. What about the glory of the Lord in the cloud and the fire returning to the temple? We never get that in the Hebrew scriptures. They rebuild in Ezra and Nehemiah's time, and yet we never see an actual, like, there's a vision story of the glory of the Lord returning to the temple, but there's never a corresponding real time story of the glory of the Lord filling the temple again. And so we have to wonder, what is this vision of the glory of the Lord coming back to the temple? What is it about?
It's God coming back to physically be with us.
It would, yes. And so, okay, how does God come to physically be with us? Remember the three time horizons that we see in prophetic literature that talks about the coming of the Lord, the day of the Lord, the fulfillment of God's promises, the day of salvation. Often we get the repetition of these three time horizons. So time horizon one will be presently, right? And the Israelites do get to return to the land in the fulfillment of a lot of these promises. And they do get to build a temple. And yet that doesn't seem to fulfill everything that this is talking about. And we see the sense of that third and longest time horizon, right? Where the end times, when the mountain of the Lord is lifted higher than any other mountain, and the nations are streaming like rivers up to it. This is a reversal of the rivers of Eden streaming down. We have the nations streaming up. And so there is that promise at the end of all of God's work. And we will see that reflected in Revelation, right? And yet, what's that middle time horizon? Where do we see the promises of salvation of the Lord happening in between?
Jesus.
Jesus is our day of salvation that is in between the physical restoration of the exiles and the end time restoration of all things, the new creation, the new heaven and the new earth, right? We have that middle time horizon, the promise of Jesus. And I think this idea, this question, when will the glory of the Lord dwell with mankind again, is in John's mind, the author of the Gospel of John, when John writes his introduction to the Jesus story, right? So turn over to the Gospel of John, chapter 1. John introduces the story of Scripture. He's thinking of the whole story, right? He begins with creation. He begins with the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made. And so the story begins in creation. And John meditated on Scripture and understood that the question was left open by the Hebrew Scriptures: when will God dwell with man? John understood that as being answered in Jesus. In verse 9, beginning in verse 9, John says, "The true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. And he was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name and gave the right to become the children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor a human decision, or a husband's will, but born of God." To become God's people in this way is why Jesus came. Right? And John says in verse 14, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling," tabernacled, tented. "The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." And picking up in verse 16, "For of his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, and grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ. No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten God, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has made him known." And so the mystery is left open in Ezekiel, but it is fulfilled in Jesus Christ. Through Jesus, God makes the dwelling, tabernacles among us, and becomes that glory, who is physically present to, to his apostles, to his people, he becomes the atoning sacrifice for our sins. The Day of Atonement that was not possible in Ezekiel's day is fulfilled and completed by Jesus at the cross, who becomes the atoning sacrifice. And then Jesus pours out the Spirit, the very Spirit that lifts Ezekiel when he has fallen. It comes in the fire and the rushing wind, these two elements that we see in the glory vision, right? The radiance of the land, the sound of the rushing waters. Like this theophany shows up again at Pentecost as the Spirit comes. And so all of us who follow him get to have that indwelling Spirit of God and become God's dwelling place. And so all the size and perfection, symmetry of the beautiful temple of Ezekiel's vision, that becomes the beauty of the Holy Spirit poured out to live in our hearts through Jesus Christ. And every north gate and south gate and gate for the guards, as we all these gates, right? They all become the one gate. As Jesus said, I am the gate for the sheep. And so those approaches, that access, it comes through Jesus. And it really is for all now, right? From Ezekiel's awesome vision, we take its fulfillment in the awesome work of Jesus Christ. Thoughts on this? I think it's sort of a big connection to make, but I think this is what was in John's mind when he said his glory has come to dwell among us. What do y'all think?
Yeah, I think certainly that's the context of the whole New Testament. I mean, like Colossians 1, I think it is, that says that he is the very image of God, and I think there it says we take on his image as we reflect as in a mirror, something like that. I'm not quoting it right, but this we're designed to bear that image, and we look upon it and we become that image when we look upon it.
Yeah, to be the temple of the Holy Spirit, as Paul puts it elsewhere, is to be a reflection of Jesus among us, to be the people who are supposed to reflect the beauty of this temple. I think the original readers of this passage in Ezekiel went, wow, this is amazing. I think when I read it, I go, wow, this is hard to get through.
This is tedious.
Um, this is a lot of measuring. But I think that the original readers would have been in awe of this heavenly temple. And I think all of that awe comes through to our opportunity to be the temple of the Spirit.
I was struck by how thin the walls were as well, because they don't feel like defensive walls at either, and the windows sloped inward, which is not which you do to make the vision, make the view better.
Okay.
They're sloped inward. They're not sloped like defensive structures. They're sloped inward, so you don't have the wall blocking your view when you stand at it.
I
Well,
wonder oh, go ahead, Judy.
I was just going to say, I just feel like the walls are more there for a line of separation, a clear marker of God being set apart, and this is fully for him.
To mark out what is holy.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, scholars, this is a comment that many scholars have made, like, these walls are too thin. I wonder if the author of Revelation thinks on that, and in the Revelation vision, there is no wall. God is its wall. Of the New Jerusalem. And so, we get some of those same ideas sort of carrying through. Yeah, maybe this temple doesn't so much need a wall as much as a defensive wall, as much as um, assistance to help us see what's holy. Well, any other comments, thoughts before we switch to our prayer time? Thank you for your discussion today. Next week, we are off for Service Day, so no meeting next week. And then the following week, we will have our final lesson on the river from the temple. And it's over Ezekiel 44 through 47. And we have an emphasis passage like we did today. Instead of trying to read that whole thing in Ezekiel 47, 1 through 12. So you can check out that. We'll meet in 2 weeks. And don't forget to let me know your thoughts on our study planning for next year. Remember, we don't just have one semester to, we have to plan that other semester too, even if we do settle on Revelation for our first semester, which it kind of, from listening to myself tonight, I sort of like, sounds like I've already gone that way, haven't it? Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks everyone. Let's do prayer time. I'll stop the recorder.